Good morning. Good to be together for a few minutes today. And before I get started, I want to mention something. I think most of you that know me at all realize I'm not the most tech savvy. I'm not on any social media, and I figure God brought me to this area to be a pastor to the people in this community, and I've never sought after a national voice or I've never, I guess a couple of times I've preached at bigger conferences, but that's not really my place. Not against it. Just not been what I don't think it's what God's called me to do. I've written some, and it's what I write or what I do like this is for our church and people that are home. I started doing these videos because people weren't getting out, and there were people sick and people, not able to get to church because of COVID or whatever. And I know there's people, here and there. I get a note from people or a text. People around the country are watching and listening to the podcasts and things. But my heart and my ministry is here locally. And if I never preached anywhere else, that'd be fine. I'm thankful that I can be a help to somebody somewhere. But anyway, so I'm not. When I write a book or a pamphlet, recently just finished a little pamphlet, things I confirmed in the valley, and valleys don't have to change our beliefs. If your beliefs are based on something as solid as the Word of God, then difficulty doesn't change your belief system. It might make you cry while you believe the same thing, but anyway, never occurred to me to promote it or to get it out to a national audience or whatever. If it happens, that's up to God. But it's mainly for our church and for our friends, and whether it be these video morning moments I do, or whatever. I started doing some marriage moments on Saturdays many years ago, and I'd send those out to people that sign up for them. But that was for our young people who were, ended up living around the country, and they're getting married. They live in different places. They'd like to get some premarital counseling or counseling right after the marriage. And it was for our young people. And many, many times, and one of our young people said, I print all of your email marriage moments, and I've got them in a notebook so I can go back and look through them. And that's, what, and they don't go to our church, don't live anywhere near us, even in nearby state, but my ministry has always been geared around our people. So all that to say, I'm not looking for how many followers I would have. I've never tried to get a social media where tons of people listen to what I say. I figure God will get people what they need. And God's given me a little corner of the world, and I'm very happy. That songwriter wrote, "Bright in the corner where you are." But I have watched sermons and listened to different people, different podcasts or whatever. And I've been surprised that a church or a Christian would monetize. Now I know that's a term, but my definition of it is that you'd sell advertising on your YouTube channel or whatever. And it's none of my business. It just kind of caught me off guard. Here I am looking at a video of a special meeting at some church or whatever, and then it's interrupted by a commercial. Now you can skip that as a general rule, but I thought that's funny, and I thought, you know what? I'm never gonna. I'm not. What we do is for God. We don't do it for gold. And I've never asked anybody that got things when we give away tons of material, and we just want to be a help. And we figure our church will provide the financial resource for our church ministries, and if we can be a help to missionaries or friends or whatever, then we do it as God provides. But anyway, so I thought, well, I'm never gonna. If somebody says you've got enough people watching your YouTube or listening to you on podcasts, we'll pay you X dollars if you will let us advertise. And I don't care what they offer to pay me. I wouldn't do it, because this is about God and this is not about gold. And so that's always been my thinking. I'm not saying it's wrong. It's just not my motivation. And then somebody said, Pastor, we were watching your video podcast and an ad popped up in the middle of it. And I said, no way. They said, yes. And I said, I hope it wasn't for anything wicked, liquor or tobacco or whatever. And I can't even remember what they said. But if an ad pops up, I want you to know I didn't do it. It's, I guess, YouTube or whoever, they own it, and I guess they can do what they want. But just so you know, I'm not monetizing. And again, I'm not even sure that, I know that's a word in the tech world. I'm not sure the proper definition. For me, I'm not going to take money to advertise a product to you. And again, I know there's people that have radio shows and different things, and that's what finances. They do and I'm not against advertising, not at all against it. But anyway, if something pops up, I'm just giving you the disclaimer. I didn't do it. I don't know about it, and nobody said, would you approve, Florsheim ads in your podcast? And who knows what could end up being advertised. So anyway, skip the ads if you want to. That's your call. But I do want you to know we don't do this for money, and that's not where we are, not what we're about. And anyway, I just want to throw that out. I'll be in Hebrews chapter 12 in a minute or two here, but I wanted to take just a moment and thank you that are in our church faithfully, that are a part of the ministry, and you serve and give here. And I realize we have friends around the country. And I hope you support financially in your prayers, your church. But you that have been so much a part of the ministry here, thank you. All that God, my wife and I were talking the other day about in 40 years, and that we're in our 40th year, actually 40th anniversary is in August, but in all these years, how good God's been, how he has guided us and provided for us. And this thing happened and that thing happened. And the property that the Lord's provided, and the workers and the friends and the ministry he's let us be a part of, the big street meetings we've been able to hold, the street preaching, the big days we call them, when we go out and preach out in the streets and in public parks and gather crowds to preach the gospel. We are a soul-winning church. We're an aggressive, bring the gospel to the world kind of church. That's what we believe. And if no one else does it, that's up to them. But we are for the bus ministry. We're for taking the gospel to jails and rest homes, and we're for going out into the community and preaching the gospel. One of our guys was going, I forget what brought it up, but he was going by I want to say it's kind of a Christian ministry. I'm not exactly sure, but big old long line of people, a bunch of people. And he went up and asked the guy in charge, said, "What are you doing?" He said, "Well, we're just trying to be help to the folks in need, and we're giving out coffee and donuts," or whatever they were giving out. And I think it was some kind of a Christian ministry thing, just because he asked him, are you giving them any tracts? Are you witnessing to them? No, we're just trying to take care of some, their need. And that's wonderful. And so the guy from our church, he said, "Well, while they're all standing up in line, do you mind if I preach to them?" And he said, "No." And he got up, if I remember right, he was in a pickup and had a big crowd of people there. And he preached the gospel. As long as they're waiting in line to get free coffee and whatever, donuts, whatever the food was they're giving out, why not hear about Christ and the free gift of eternal life? That is our mentality. And it's always been our mentality from the very beginning. And we love getting to do what we get to do. And God has given us so many opportunities. And God's put wonderful workers in our church. And sometime years ago, someone asked me, "How did you get your people to do this?" And I said, "I didn't get our people to do nothing. God's touched hearts, and people have just stepped up and said, 'Hey, what would you think of this or that?' And I certainly didn't do it. And there are things that the members of our church get involved in and do ministry-wise that would never cross my mind. And it was their idea. They're involved in this or that or whatever. And our rest home, we've been in, I don't know how many hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of people have been saved in our rest home services. God opened the doors. One day, one of our elderly ladies got in a car accident, and Sula Splittick, if you're very much an old timer around here, and Sula was driving and got in an accident, broke her neck, and she was at a hospital in Loma Linda, about an hour drive away. And so I went up to visit her, and she just was so up and so encouraging, had the bolts in her head and the halo and the shoulder things, and She said, "Oh, it's just a beautiful place to be. Isn't God so good to me, Pastor?" I think, and I'm looking in the hospital as a vegetarian that time. I don't know if it still is. Seventh-day Adventist, a vegetarian meals, and I'm thinking, well, look at the food you got, and your view out the window is a brick wall, and you're here, and you got a broken neck, but she's a better Christian than me, but so she got out of there, and then she was moved into Cypress Gardens convalescent home. It's in Riverside, about an hour away. And so I just thought, had a bunch of teenagers I was taking out on Wednesdays going soul winning. And so I said, hey, why don't we go visit Miss Sula? So we piled up, I don't know, a dozen or so teenagers, drove all the way to Riverside, and hung around, visited with her, sang some, and just visited a while. And then as we were leaving, the social director said, would you be willing to come again and bring these kids? And I said, well, I don't know, if you want, we could. I had no intention of starting a ministry. We just wanted to be a blessing to one of our ladies, and it ended up every week we were bringing. It wasn't me all the time. It was Brother Miller, he was our youth director at the time. He or others would bring teenagers in who'd sing, and then it got where we're walking around the convalescent home saying, hey, we're having church services in a little bit. You want to come? And it might have been Wednesday afternoon, might have been Saturday afternoon, but we gathered people, and we for many years we were there at Cypress Gardens, and then our people in our church got exposed, realized how convenient. It's not a difficult thing to work in a rest home. Of course, it's nice because the floors are leveled. If you don't walk real well, it's geared around people that are maybe a little not so steady on their feet or whatever. And so a lot of our older people were able to get involved. The next thing I know, one of our men has got a service going in a rest home in Sun City or Paris. I think it was Paris, and I didn't know anything about it. I said, you're going over there? He said, yeah, I just went in and asked. They said, sure, come on in. And he'd go there every Sunday afternoon after church, and he'd preach. And with COVID, I think we have only one rest home open to guests right now. But at this moment, I know it varies back and forth, but we got into many, many rest homes, and we had teams going out. And see, it's just God who opened those things. It's our people who got this idea. And it's just been so good to see to see God's involvement in our lives. And I love knowing that God is involved. That's what Romans 8:28 is all about, that God is going to work all things together for our good if we love God. I talked about that the other day. But I want to mention just a short note of a biography, just one paragraph. This man, George Lowell, may have been one of America's first or the first foreign missionary. He was a slave. He was saved in 1773 in a Baptist church. He became the first ordained African-American preacher in America. He preached during the Revolutionary War. He and a friend founded the first African Baptist church in America, located in Savannah, Georgia. In 1784, he went to Jamaica and started a church there. In 8 years, he baptized 500 converts. He was jailed, falsely accused of stirring up a rebellion. His church sent out 50 missionaries to travel around the world preaching the gospel. And here's a guy who just said, you can jail me, but we're going to still get the job done. And you can accuse me and slander me. But the fact that he had a slave background did not prevent him from loving God and living for God and serving God and starting a church, and then going to the mission field and starting a church that would send out multiple missionaries. And that this whole book it's entitled, If They Can Make It, You Can Too. Pastor Mike Ray put these just little short synopsis of various biographies together. But the point is, greatness is not found in ease. Greatness is found in character, to press on when it's not easy. And that is certainly the Christian life. I want to read a couple of verses for you today in Hebrews chapter 12. And I love this chapter, and I've taken time to memorize most of it. But I'm going to read just one verse. If you're in Hebrews chapter 12, you want to look at it here with me. And he says in Hebrews 12:4, ye have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin. And I think of that verse, I always think of what my parents would say. As a child, you fall down, you hurt yourself, whatever, and crying a little bit. And they'd say, oh, let me look at it. Oh, you're not bleeding. And the comment was, if you're not bleeding, you've got no reason to be crying. You'll be all right. Well, Obviously, as the years go by, I realize a whole lot of things to cry about. But as a child, you skin your knee, your elbow, your shoulder, whatever. We can live through this and we'll be all right. But in context, as we look at this, if I just go back to Ephesians 4:32, it says, "Be ye kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, even as God for Christ's sake hath forgiven you." And the admonition to forgive in Ephesians 4 is because of how much God has forgiven us. And of course, in the Gospels, in Matthew 5, I believe it is, he says you should have mercy on others because of how merciful God's been to you. And the familiar parable where the servant who owed a great debt begged for mercy and he was forgiven. And then he went and had a co-worker threatened with prison if he didn't pay back the little tiny bit that he owed him. And then the first creditor challenged the first guy, "If you're not willing to forgive that little bit after I forgave all that you have, and I'm going to demand everything," and the guy threw him in jail. And he said, "So also shall your heavenly Father do to you if you from your heart forgive not every man his brother, his neighbor." You know, if somebody's hurt you, if somebody's hurt me, God asks us to forgive. Just simple as that. Why should I forgive those people who hurt me? Because God forgave me. That's the bottom line. Now, for an unsaved person, I understand it. They don't understand the forgiveness of God. They don't understand the love of God. But for a Christian, we need to understand God has forgiven us a great debt. A debt that would have left us for eternity in hell. I mean, after 10,000 years in hell, it would be another 10,000 and another 10. And it's hard for even a human mind to imagine the suffering and the torment. And God just forgave it, forgave our sin. He just forgave it. Why? Because of love. And he says, "Now I'd like you to forgive others." And, there's some examples in the Bible, Remember Joseph? His brothers sold him. To be sold as a slave is terrible. To be sold by your family members as a slave, that would be worse. And recently I heard an interview of this gal from North Korea who escaped North Korea to China, China to Mongolia, then to South Korea, and then eventually in America. And this lady said she would help her escape North Korea. What she didn't know is she was going to help her by selling her into slavery as a prostitute and into the human trafficking of young girls. She was 13 years old. And what a tragedy to be sold. But that was a stranger. But when your family sells you, here Joseph's brothers sold him, and 13 years pass. Long years. He's a slave for some years. Then he's in prison for some years. And finally, by the grace of God, he finds his way out of prison. And God in his mercy puts him as the ruler of the land next to Pharaoh. And you know the story of Joseph, of course. But the key thing is you go to the last chapter or two of Genesis, and Joseph's brothers come to him. And their dad had died. And they felt like Joseph had been patient with them because their dad had been there. But now dad's dead. And they said, "Oh, dad gone, we're in big trouble." And Joseph said, "It was not you that sent me. It was God. God sent me here to save many souls alive." And it's a really hard thing to grasp, but in reality, that trial that comes into my life, that hurt that you face, that thing was sent into your life by God so somebody would get saved. Now, none of us feel like we're great evangelists. Of course, in the Old Testament case of Joseph, it was saved from starvation, saved from the horrors of famine. But in our lives, Romans 8:28, God will work all things together for good. For whom he did foreknow, he also did predestinate. And I talked about that the other day. Another good story, if you're in Hebrews chapter 12, go back a few pages right before Hebrews chapter 1 to the book of Philemon. If you'd find the book of Philemon, and it's so small, you'll skip right over it, just 25 verses. But in the book of Philemon is a great truth, and I may be preaching on this, but you'll forget it anyway between when you watch this and when you hear me preach. But the story of Philemon, God had sent the Apostle Paul to the city of Colossae. He'd won this man, Philemon, to Christ. And in the first couple of verses, Paul, a prisoner of Jesus Christ, and Timothy, our brother, unto Philemon, our dearly beloved and fellow laborer. Paul's in jail. He's sending a letter back to Colossae to this man, Philemon. And turns out Paul had come to Colossae and led this Philemon to Christ. The guy began to grow and was so excited about his faith, they started a church in Philemon's home. And you could read about him in the book of Acts as well. But Philemon, he would have been on his way to hell were it not for the Apostle Paul. It was Paul's dedication that caused Philemon to be able to know he was going to go to heaven one day. And it was Paul willing to pay a price to be a missionary. It was Paul's willing to live a sacrificial life and all that he did. Well, so Paul goes, wins Philemon to Christ, wins many others to Christ, starts a church there in Colossae. And of course, he went town to town. He ended up in prison in Rome. In prison in Rome, he meets this guy named Onesimus. And he gets talking to Onesimus. They're cellmates. He leads Onesimus to Christ. By the way, Paul was in jail for a reason. Number one, I think, to write multiple books of your New Testament that he wrote from prison. For another reason he was in jail was to lead Philemon to Christ. And many people got saved, but there were key people Paul led to Christ. He was not in jail because of wicked men and an unjust government. He was not in jail because the powers that be overpowered righteousness and that God couldn't help Paul and the Christians couldn't help. No, God knew what was going on. There was no accident Paul was there. And so Paul wins this guy Onesimus to Christ. Well, it turns out they get talking over the days, who knows, weeks, however long they're in jail together, and finds out Onesimus is from Colossae. Oh, you're from Colossae? Well, I started a church in Colossae. Really? Yeah. I started a church. I've got a friend in Colossae named Philemon. Onesimus says, oh my, that's who I work for. That's why I'm in big trouble here, because I was a slave in Philemon's home. And I took some of his stuff, I robbed him, and I took off, and I got caught, and now I'm sitting here in this jail rotting away because I stole from Philemon. And Paul said, oh, you need to go back and get it right. And Philemon said, if I go back there, he was going to get out, whatever he was in jail for in Rome, maybe it was something totally unrelated. We have no idea, but he was going to get out. And Paul said, you need to go back to Colossae. Well, I go back to Colossae until Philemon, I'm sorry, or what I did, he's going to put me in jail, or I'll probably kill me. And Paul said, tell you what I'll do, Onesimus, if you go back to Philemon to get this thing right, I'll write you a personal letter of recommendation that'll get you in the door, and it'll be okay. And oh, could you imagine, here he'd stolen from, slaves were just property. And he'd stolen from the guy that owned him and then ran off. And here in jail, he gets saved. And let me just give you a quick verse or two here. In verse, he's writing a letter to Philemon to receive Onesimus. Verse 10, I beseech thee for my son Onesimus, whom I have begotten in my bonds. When I was in jail, he became my son. I led him to Christ. It's a wonderful thing. In verse 11, which in time past to thee was unprofitable, but now profitable to thee and to me. I know he stole from you, Philemon. He was very unprofitable as a servant, but you know what? He'll be profitable now. He'll work with you. He'll work for you. And I'm sending him back to you. And he goes on, verse 12, whom I have sent to thee. Therefore receive him, that is mine own bowels. I want you to send him. And there's a lot of stuff in here that's so good. But in verse 14, but without thy mind would I do nothing, that thy benefit should not be as it were of necessity, but willingly. He said, I want you to take Onesimus in, and I want you to treat him good, like a benefit, a dinner, a fundraiser dinner, a benefit. But I want it to be willing. I want you to do it out of your own heart. And verse 15, for perhaps therefore he departed for a season, that thou shouldst receive him forever. Not now, I'm in verse 16, not now as a servant, but above a servant, as a brother beloved. Oh, he says, I want you to receive him as if he was your long lost brother. I want you to, when Onesimus comes in your front door, Philemon, I want you to bring him into your home as family, not as a servant, but as a brother. And verse 17, if thou count me therefore a partner, receive him as myself. Oh, don't just receive him as a brother, receive him like it was me. Onesimus or Philemon, if I knocked on your door, you'd open the door and you'd welcome me and you'd give me the best room and you'd give me food and clothing and care. That's how I want you to treat Onesimus. He goes on, pardon me. Then he says in verse 18, if he hath wronged thee or oweth thee aught, put that on my account. He said, whatever he owes you, blame me for it. Whatever financial wrong you have experienced, bill me, I'll pay it. If, of course, he did wrong him. And he said, if he's wrong you, would you put it on my account? And then Paul kind of tightens the screws. Verse 21, having confidence in thy obedience, I wrote unto thee, knowing that thou wilt also do more than I say. So he said, receive him as a brother, receive him as myself. He said, if he owes you anything, put it on my account. And this is such a tender story. And can you imagine Onesimus sheepishly and humbly going back to get right and to make right what he'd done wrong? And by the way, every one of us should do that. There should be a willingness in our heart to say, I was wrong and I'm sorry. And I was wrong about what I said, I was wrong about how I acted, I was wrong about my words or my behavior. Nothing wrong with that. That's how a Christian acts. And these shallow social media mandated apologies, that this news show or this publisher has to put out a public apology, that doesn't mean a thing. That's not from their heart. They don't mean it at all. Paul said, I want you to do it like a brother. I want you to treat him like it was me. And if there's any debt, put it on my account. You know what Jesus did for you? He hung on that cross and he said, Father, I know these people have offended you, but if they're willing to come to you and ask for forgiveness, I want you to forgive them like me. I want you to treat them like me. I want them to be received as a brother beloved. And Father, whatever wrong they've done you, put it on my account. And that's what Jesus did on Calvary. He offered to take your sin debt and mine. And the only reason I'm going to heaven today is because a brother beloved, the Lord Jesus Christ, hung on a cross and he paid my sin debt. And he said to the one I owed a great debt, I was a debtor and I deserved hell. And the Father in heaven, who should have exacted his wrath upon me and sent me to hell, Jesus says, Father, would you receive this man as if it were me? And any wrong that they did, you put it on my account. I love this thing of forgiveness. I love a God that teaches, and not only a God that is forgiving, but a God that teaches forgiveness. A God so often in the Bible talks about forgiveness. And I want to encourage you today, have a clean conscience, have a clean heart, and have a heart of love and forgiveness, that there'd be no person on earth that you don't have a tenderness and a love toward. That's Christianity. Now, we may not want to work with them because they did whatever at work, and I may not let them handle if they were my dog walkers and my dog starved to death, got hit by a car, I may not let them walk my dog, but I'm okay. I'm not going to hate him. I'm going to love him, and I may let them clean my pool, but I'm not letting them walk my dog. But you know what? To love them, to love people, and that idea, put it on my account. And so he encourages us. So back where I started, Hebrews 12, he said, I want you to keep your eyes on Jesus, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith. That's about verse 1 or 2. You keep your eye on Jesus. And let's just look at that real quick, and I'll close. I'm probably a minute or two over, but you can shut me off anytime you want. Not like church. You can push the mute button here. You can't do that at church. But in Hebrews chapter 12 and verse 2, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame. He despised the shame he had to face, naked and stripped and beaten and abused and slandered and ridiculed. And he just took it. And then in verse 3, consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself. The evil treatment Jesus received. Just consider him. And he said, I want you just to understand that God's there, and there this evil treatment Jesus received, and yet he loved them and he forgave them. And then he says in verse 7 about enduring chastening. Maybe God's chastening you for something, but you don't give up. And he talks about here, you have not yet, verse 4, you have not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin. He says in the verse prior, verse 3, verse 3, for consider him that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself, lest you be weary and faint in your mind. You'll get tired of people. People will wear you out. So you consider Jesus, and he'll strengthen you. They that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. He'll strengthen you. And then you'll have that strength, that internal strength. And he said, you've not yet resisted unto blood, striving against sin. You're not bleeding. You can live through this thing. You just keep loving people and realize it's a dirty old world. It is an unjust world. It's a world filled with garbage, but there's a better world coming. And that's our job, is to tell people how to find that better world where there's no ugly, no mean, no foul, and no greed, and no covetousness, and a world they pave the streets in gold, and they're not impressed with somebody's car or phone or house or clothing. We have a great God, and we'll be all right. We just keep faithfully serving God. Whatever the stupid things politicians do, it's going to be okay. Whatever mandates and laws there are, just hang in there. We have a good God, and he's going to see us through. And let's just take this week and let's live it for God. We have a great, great God. Let's live for him.